Ikochukwu sat on the edge of his rickety tricycle, staring at the dusty road ahead. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, not from the cold but from the weight of his thoughts. The villagers' laughter echoed in his ears, their mocking words cutting deeper than any knife. Poor Ikochukwu, they would say, a man with nothing but a broken tricycle and empty pockets. Even his own family had started to look at him with pity, and he couldn't bear it anymore. But the worst part was the plan he had set in motion, a plan that could destroy the one person who had always stood by him, Amora. Amora was different. She didn't care about his poverty or the rusted tricycle he rode. She loved him for who he was, always encouraging him with her warm smile and kind words. But Ikochukwu's heart was heavy with desperation. He was tired of being poor, tired of the humiliation, and tired of waiting for a miracle that never came. That's why he had gone to the city to see Obinna, his old friend who was now a billionaire. Obinna, or Obi-Ego, as they called him, had promised to show him the way to wealth. But what Ikochukwu discovered was far darker than he could have ever imagined. Obinna lived in a mansion surrounded by tall fences and guarded gates. His cars gleamed in the sun, and his clothes were made of the finest fabrics. But as Ikochukwu stepped into the house, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air was heavy, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets. Obinna greeted him with a smile, but his eyes were cold and empty. "I told you to come to the city if you wanted to make money," Obinna said, his voice low and steady. "But the kind of money I have comes with a price." Ikochukwu listened as Obinna explained the secret cult he belonged to, the Dark Knights. They were a brotherhood of men who had traded their humanity for wealth. Obinna spoke of rituals and sacrifices, of giving up the things that mattered most in exchange for power. He revealed that he had sacrificed his own manhood and was forbidden from helping anyone, even his own mother. "This is the life I chose," Obinna said, his voice devoid of emotion. "If you want to join us, you must be willing to do the same." That night, at exactly 1 a.m., Obinna took Ikochukwu to the cult's secret meeting place deep in the forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the trees. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, and the sound of chanting filled the night. Ikochukwu's heart pounded as he was led to a circle of men dressed in black robes. Their faces were hidden, but their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The leader of the cult, a tall man with a voice like thunder, stepped forward. "Ikochukwu," he said, "you have come seeking wealth. But wealth comes at a price. To join the Dark Knights, you must prove your loyalty. You must sacrifice someone you love." Ikochukwu's blood ran cold. "Sacrifice," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The leader nodded, his eyes piercing into Ikochukwu's soul. "Yes. You must kill the person who means the most to you. Only then will you be initiated into our brotherhood." Ikochukwu's mind raced. Who could he sacrifice? His mother. No, he couldn't do that. His friends. They had already turned their backs on him. Then it hit him, Amora. The thought made him sick to his stomach, but the leader's voice echoed in his mind, "Sacrifice someone you love." The leader handed him a small vial of poison. "This will make it quick and painless," he said. "Put it in her food, and your initiation will be complete." Ikochukwu took the vial, his hands shaking. He wanted to refuse, to run away and never look back. But the thought of escaping poverty was too tempting. He nodded, his heart heavy with guilt. The next morning, Ikochukwu returned to the village, the vial of poison hidden in his pocket. He had invited Amora over for dinner, pretending everything was normal. But as he stirred the pot of oha, his heart ached with guilt. He loved Amora, but the promise of wealth was too tempting to ignore. Little did he know, fate had other plans. Ikochukwu stood in his small kitchen, staring at the pot of oha simmering on the stove. The aroma of the soup filled the room, but it did nothing to calm his nerves. His hands shook as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small vial of poison the cult had given him. The leader's words echoed in his mind, "Sacrifice someone you love." He had chosen Amora, but the thought of what he was about to do made him sick to his stomach. He poured the poison into the soup, stirring it quickly to make sure it dissolved. His heart raced as he dished out the food onto a plate, placing it on the table. He glanced at the clock. Amora would be here soon. He needed to act normal, to make sure she didn't suspect anything. But the guilt was eating him alive. Just as he was about to sit down, he realized he had forgotten to buy a drink. Amora loved to have a cold drink with her meals, and he didn't want her to notice anything unusual. "I'll just run to the shop quickly," he muttered to himself, trying to calm his nerves. He grabbed his keys and rushed out of the house, leaving the plate of poisoned food on the table. The shop was only a few minutes away, but the walk felt like an eternity. Ikochukwu's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What if Amora found out? What if she refused to eat the food? What if the poison didn't work? He shook his head, trying to push the doubts away. He had come too far to turn back now. When he returned with the bottle of drink, he noticed something strange. The door to his house was slightly open, and he could hear faint groaning sounds coming from inside. His heart skipped a beat. "Amora," he called out, rushing into the house. But it wasn't Amora. It was his mother, Neoma. She was on the floor, clutching her stomach and writhing in pain. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, and her face was pale and sweaty. The plate of ofe oha was empty, and the fork lay discarded on the floor. Ikochukwu's heart sank as he realized what had happened. "Mama," he screamed, dropping the bottle of drink and rushing to her side. "What are you doing here? Why did you eat the food?" Neoma looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain and confusion. I came back from the farm," she gasped, her voice weak. "I was so hungry. I saw the food on the table. I thought you made it for me." She let out a cry of agony, clutching her stomach tighter. "Ikochukwu, what's in this food? What have you done?" Ikochukwu's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. The poison was meant for Amora, not his mother. "Mama, I'm so sorry," he cried, tears streaming down his face. "It wasn't meant for you. It wasn't meant for you." Neoma's eyes widened in horror as she realized the truth. You poisoned the food," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My own son, you wanted to kill someone." Before Ikochukwu could respond, she let out a final, agonized groan and collapsed onto the floor, her body going still. Ikochukwu stared at his mother's lifeless body, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he done? He had killed his own mother, the woman who had raised him and loved him unconditionally. The guilt was overwhelming, and he felt like he was drowning in it. Just then, he heard footsteps outside. It was Amora. She walked into the house, her face lighting up with joy. "Ikochukwu, I'm here," she called out. But her smile faded when she saw the scene before her. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ikochukwu looked up at her, his eyes filled with guilt and despair. "Amora, I didn't mean for this to happen," he stammered. Amora's eyes widened as she noticed the plate of food and Neoma's lifeless body. "Wait, did you poison her?" she asked, her voice rising in horror. Ikochukwu couldn't speak. He just stared at her, tears streaming down his face. Amora stepped back, her hands covering her mouth. "You were going to kill me, weren't you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "The food was meant for me, right?" Ikochukwu broke down in tears and cried, "Please forgive me, Amora. I was just tired of my situation, the humiliation. I just wanted a good life for myself. I just wanted to make money by all means." Amora's heart shattered into a million pieces. "How could you?" she cried, her voice filled with pain and anger. "After everything we've been through. After all the love I've shown you. You were going to use me for money rituals." She turned and ran out of the house, screaming for help. "People of Anioma, come and see. Ikochukwu has killed his own mother." Within minutes, the village square was filled with people. They gathered around Ikochukwu, their faces filled with shock and anger. Amora stood in the center, tears streaming down her face as she told them what had happened. "He wanted to kill me for money rituals," she said, her voice trembling. But his mother ate the poisoned food instead. The villagers were furious. They grabbed Ikochukwu, dragging him to the center of the square. "How could you do such a thing?" one man shouted. "You've brought shame to our village." Another woman spat on the ground, her eyes filled with disgust. "You don't deserve to live among us," she said. "You're a monster." Ikochukwu hung his head in shame, unable to defend himself. He had brought this upon himself, and now he had to face the consequences. The village elders gathered to decide his fate. After hours of deliberation, they reached a decision. Ikochukwu, the oldest elder, said, his voice stern, "You are hereby banished from Anioma. You must leave immediately and never return." Ikochukwu's heart sank. He had lost everything, his mother, Amora, and now his home. But he knew he deserved it. As he packed his few belongings and prepared to leave, he couldn't help but think about Obinna. This was all his fault. If he hadn't introduced him to the Dark Knights, none of this would have happened. Anger burned in Ikochukwu's chest as he made his way to the city, determined to confront Obinna and make him pay. Ikochukwu walked through the bustling streets of the city, his heart heavy with guilt and anger. The noise of cars honking and people shouting filled the air, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was Obinna and the Dark Knights. They had ruined his life, and now he was determined to make them pay. He arrived at Obinna's mansion, the tall gates and high walls a stark reminder of the wealth that had cost so much. Ikochukwu pounded on the gate, his fist clenched in rage. "Obinna," he shouted. "Come out here. I know you're in there." After a few moments, the gate creaked open, and Obinna stepped out. He looked as polished as ever, his expensive suit gleaming in the sunlight. But his eyes were cold and empty, just like they had been during the initiation. "Ikochukwu," he said, his voice calm. "What are you doing here? I thought you were back in the village." Ikochukwu's anger boiled over. "You," he shouted, grabbing Obinna by the collar. "You did this to me. You made me kill my own mother. You ruined my life." Obinna didn't flinch. He simply stared at Ikochukwu, his expression unreadable. "You chose this path," he said quietly. "I only showed you the way. The Dark Knights don't force anyone to join. You made the decision to sacrifice someone you love." Ikochukwu's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on Obinna's collar. "You lied to me," he screamed. "You said I would be rich, that I would never suffer again. But all I got was pain and loss." Obinna's eyes narrowed. "You didn't follow through," he said coldly. "You were supposed to sacrifice Amora, not your mother. The Dark Knights don't tolerate failure." Ikochukwu's rage reached its peak. Without thinking, he lunged at Obinna, his hands wrapping around the man's throat. "You ruined my life," he screamed, shaking Obinna violently. "You took everything from me. Now I'm going to take everything from you." Obinna struggled, his hands clawing at Ikochukwu's arms, but he was no match for the younger man's strength. Within minutes, Obinna's body went limp, and he collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Ikochukwu stood over him, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He had done it. He had killed the man who had destroyed his life. But as he turned to leave, a strange feeling came over him. The sky, which had been clear just moments ago, was now filled with dark clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the air grew heavy with the scent of rain. Ikochukwu looked up, his heart pounding. "What's happening?" he whispered. Before he could take another step, a bolt of lightning struck the ground in front of him, sending him flying backward. He landed hard on the ground, his body trembling with pain. As he struggled to get up, he heard a voice, a deep, thunderous voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Ikochukwu," the voice said, "you have betrayed the Dark Knights. You have taken the life of one of our own. For this, you must pay." Ikochukwu's eyes widened in fear. "No," he whispered. "Please, no." But it was too late. Another bolt of lightning struck him, and this time, the pain was unbearable. He screamed as his body convulsed, his mind filled with images of his mother, Amora, and the life he had lost. When the lightning finally subsided, Ikochukwu was no longer the same. His eyes were wild, his hair disheveled, and his clothes torn. He stumbled to his feet, laughing and crying at the same time. "I'm free," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty streets. "I'm finally free." But the people who saw him knew the truth. Ikochukwu had gone mad. He wandered the city, muttering to himself and laughing at nothing. The once proud Keke rider was now a shadow of his former self, a broken man haunted by his choices. Meanwhile, back in the village of Anioma, Amore tried to pick up the pieces of her life. The betrayer had left her heartbroken, but she knew she had to move on. She found solace in the kindness of a man named Chike, a wealthy trader who had always admired her from afar. Chike was gentle and patient, and he treated Amora with the love and respect she deserved. Over time, Amora's wounds began to heal. She married Chike, and together they built a life filled with love and happiness. But she never forgot about Ikochukwu. Sometimes, late at night, she would wonder what had become of him. Was he still out there, wandering the streets like a madman? Or had he found peace in some way? As for Ikochukwu, his story became a cautionary tale in Anioma. Parents would tell their children about the man who had sacrificed everything for wealth, only to lose his mind and his soul. "Remember Ikochukwu," they would say. "No amount of money is worth losing your humanity." But the story didn't end there. The dark nights were still out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. And somewhere, deep in the city, a man with wide eyes and a broken mind still roamed the streets, a living reminder of the price of greed.